Truth without grace is just condemnation.
Grace without truth is just permission.
We need both truth and grace.
It's how we should view all the things that happen in the world through those lenses.
Welcome to the Tagcast. We are your hosts, Jonathan
And Janae, and today we are looking at the topic of what does it truly mean to be pro-life? Most of the time, probably when you're asked that question, you immediately think of the abortion issue. But we want to look at the topic in a broader sense. What does it truly mean to have a pro-life perspective?
Yeah, and because of that term, pro-life tends to be used in association with more of like a pro-birth perspective in regards to abortion. And I think, I don't know if it's just because abortion is like so in your face and, there's a bunch of activities and protests and marches on both sides and all this stuff. But what we want to try and do is look at pro-life from the perspective that it is an affirmation that all lives are equally valuable in the eyes of Creator God, right? I mean, Is that kind of where we want to go with this? And so what we're going to do is, yes, we will cover abortion, but we're also going to be covering a other variety of aspects where life isn't necessarily seen as valuable. And before we get into this, we really want to start on a good note that's like, hey, maybe you've walked through some of these scenarios and situations that we're going to press into. And as we talk about how God values life, if you have made a decision that maybe has devalued life, we got to do truth and grace, right? We want you to understand that we're not condemning you, because what pro-life really means is that your life is still valuable to Creator God. Making decisions that devalue life is sin, but every sin, regardless of what the sin looks like, is breaking our relationship with God. And we're not trying to minimize. I know we've heard it before. I've said it before. All sin is equal in the eyes of God. And that can feel almost condescending, like you don't know the brokenness that I've walked through. And that might be true. Maybe we don't know some of the brokenness that has been done to you or that you've done to others. But what this word of God says is that He still values your life immeasurably and wants to restore relationship with you. And so we just want to start there. That we're going to talk about ways life is devalued, but to start from the beginning that regardless of who you are and what you've walked through, your life is valued by God.
And I think as a society, it feels like the concept as a whole that life is valuable, that all life is valuable, has changed. Especially, I feel like in the last probably 25 to 50 years since the Roe v. Wade decision was made in 1973 by the Supreme Court. And so most of the time when we talk about pro-life, people immediately jump to people standing outside of an abortion clinic, picketing with signs, trying to dissuade people from entering, angry people that are in someone's face, screaming. And all of that has kind of been thrust back into the spotlight because this past summer, the Supreme Court in the Dobbs case decided that the national or the federal level protection for abortion was unconstitutional. And so it didn't outlaw abortion. It sent that decision back to each individual state. So instead of being regulated at the federal level, which it had been for the last 50 years, it was sent back to each state. And so as we've walked through this since June, since that decision came out, what we're seeing is that it's really not, the issue used to be So is it a baby?
So
At what
specifically
point-
when we're talking about the abortion issue, because we are
Right.
going to cover variety, but let's start here. Yeah.
because that is the probably the biggest issue when we talk about what it means to be pro-life.
Sure.
The most, maybe the
Obvious
low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And so with this decision, the thing that we're seeing is that because of medical advances in technology since the 70s, when it was originally decided, when the discussion was more based on, well, it's not really a baby yet.
Right.
You know, we can't determine that it's fine. That's why abortion is okay up to a certain point. But now because of advances in technology, there was a study done just a couple years ago, and it surveyed almost 6,000 biologists and scientists that work in this area. And 96% of them agreed that life begins at fertilization.
This isn't like a religious thing. This is just a biological thing.
Correct. And of the people that were surveyed, 85% of them would have considered themselves poor choice. 90% considered them from a liberal mindset. These were not Christians that they were surveying.
Right.
These were just scientists who, because of the medical advances, they can no longer argue this is not a life. But what we found is that people no longer are sitting there. We're not just anti-abortion, we're anti-choice. And so the laws that we're seeing now, things like the bills that are trying to protect babies that in an abortion have been born alive, and they need to offer medical care to them.
What that means is earlier in the pregnancy, the mother went through an abortion process, but the baby survived, and then they're born alive.
And at that point, there are certain states that require that medical care be given to that infant. But there are some states that have now passed laws that say even if that baby in a later stage abortion where it is able to survive outside of the womb, if that baby is born alive, that no medical care needs to be given. And so it's the mother's choice versus that baby's right to life. It's not about whether it's a baby or not. It's whether I, as the mother, have complete control over everything related to this at all points. And so the discussion is being reframed. And I think that reframing of the discussion then leads us into all the other areas that we're going to discuss that kind of filter into what does it really mean to be pro-life?
And you know, we had a conversation on euthanasia and how some countries are actually like encouraging when people are no longer able to contribute to the society, right? Like, you know, take your own life and here's the supplies to do it. And yeah, a human life is, I can't even quite wrap my head around the way the world is shifting the way it views a human life. And it almost kind of has to start from this place of, is there a God? Because, I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense. If there is no God, then we're all just walking, talking meat bags, I guess, right? But if there's a God and he created people with a divine imprint and with a purpose and a value, like at every season and stage of being alive, there is something intrinsically valuable in being alive.
And if we look at scripture like Psalm 139, where it says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." And that doesn't say that you were created without any issues. You were created without any problems. You were created. It says God knew how he formed each and every person and that life has value.
Yeah, he wasn't like, he didn't get distracted by, you know, part of the show that he was watching when he made each person. No, he intentionally was deliberately aware of what was going on in the developmental process, and his divine imprint is on every person. And this verse is often used. I've heard it often used for the anti-abortion, pro-birth perspective. But I mean, I think David wrote this. He wasn't writing this about babies. He was writing this about his own life and every step that he's taken in life, all the mistakes that he made, all the times he devalued life, right? And he's still like having to wrestle with this internal tension of, no, there is divine value on life that God has deliberately and intentionally woven together.
And we often stop. I think sometimes the church has stopped at the point of, maybe not anymore, but it used to be that every church was pro-life, but now there are some progressive movements that probably have changed their stance on that. But a lot of people felt like the church lost its way because it stopped there. It stopped in those instances of what does it really mean to have a fully pro-life perspective? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to value every child that has been born and be helpful in situations where kids might be in an abusive situation or in foster care or human trafficking or slavery around the world? Mm-hmm. All of these other things that impact the value that we place on another human being's life.
Yeah, because I remember growing up in the 90s and I didn't fully grasp I'll just be honest, I'm being transparent. Like, I didn't really understand why abortion was a big deal. Like, I was like, I heard the arguments, rape and incest and all these things, and I'm like, okay, I guess. But it was never really about that, right? It was even in those situations, like, that's still valuable life that God designed and formed. But, so I was always like, I couldn't quite understand why abortion was such a big deal. And then I would hear these other arguments that said, well, you Christians, you pro-lifers, you pro-birthers, what do you do with that baby when it's born? You want it to be born, but then you don't want to take care of it after the fact. And that really did a gut check for me when I heard that. And it's like, yeah, there's all these other elements of a person's being that, and I witnessed, I think was many people witnessed that is where the church kind of stopped and it said pro-birth. And then they just kind of took their hands off. But so before we jump too far ahead, I do want to, there is some other verses that we had here. Isaiah 44:24, thus says the Lord, your Redeemer. This just hit me just right now, because redemption is taking something that has lost value and redeeming its value. And so your Redeemer says this. He's the one who formed you in the womb. And he says, I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, who spread out the earth by myself. He made this ever-expanding, seemingly infinite universe, and you.
And the thing is that phrase that our Redeemer is just as valid at this point in your life as it was when you were created. He is he continues to be our Redeemer, no matter what age we are, what stage we are. He continues to offer that same offer of redemption. And you just think the richness of the grace that he offers us. Mm-hmm. But he he was from the beginning, but he's still that to us.
Right. Yeah. Because if we go back to the euthanasia episode, you talked about Johnny Erickson Tada, she was born perfectly healthy or whatever, and then went through this phase where she became a paraplegic. Everything changed, and even in that moment, she was still as valuable, right? And so, but it's also for people who sin and walk through seasons where they devalue life. Like the Redeemer says, I can still redeem the value here. And yeah, that's just really cool.
In Psalm, I think it's Psalm 20, is it 27? says that I believe my Redeemer lives, that he is good and he is faithful because he lives.
My Redeemer lives. Yeah. But okay, so now let's kind of like get into, I think, some ways that we've seen the church grow, and not that the church wasn't doing these things, but maybe just not necessarily in the spotlight like they, activists and advocating for pro-birth when it comes to abortion. But I think, I personally recognize, I'm like, oh yeah, what is the church doing to advocate for the pro-life of a human being after they're born? Is that it? And then they go hands off? But no, there are some things. You kind of already touched on it. Sorry, I'm just going to kind of revisit real quick. So there's these other areas, orphans, right? So James says true religion is taking care of widows and orphans. There's value of life there that gets missed. How is the church working to value the life of someone who doesn't have parents or someone who's old and, seen as a burden on society? And how are we taking care of them? There's human trafficking. In 2021, there were 10,359 situations of human trafficking reported in the U.S. involving over 16,000 people.
That statistic just blows my mind because I feel like this is an issue of the pro-life worldview that has really kind of popped up our maybe acknowledgement of the problem that's out there. Some of that is because communication is so much easier than it used to be within the last probably 20 years, even last decade. But because different countries value life less than we do in the United States. So you can look at the United States and some of the issues we have, but slavery and some of these other things in nations where poverty is more rampant and parents maybe don't feel they have a choice to take care of the children that they have, things like putting their children into slavery or selling them into human trafficking,
right,
feel like their only options. And I think for a long time, I did not realize, and I think a lot of us didn't realize the depths of this sin that was going on, the depths of this tragedy for so many young girls, especially, but also boys.
Sure, yeah, and people in general, right? And we've started to see some church communities step up and press into human trafficking. Just one that I'm aware of that my wife and I have been involved in before is Rafa House, which I think has changed its name to Rafa International, which I'll talk a little bit more on later. But, there's things, even just to the extent of like abusive relationships, right? Like, what are we doing to value that person stuck in an abusive relationship, whether they're a male or female? It happens on both sides. It's just reported more frequently in one. Children stuck in abusive relationships, right? What about, we talked about widows, the elderly, the disabled, people who cannot care for themselves. Like, what is the church doing to step out and value their lives as well?
And I think the other piece of it is people often look at the church and say, well, the church doesn't do anything to help these things. But a lot of it is because the church isn't promoting the things that it has been doing for a long time. Like, if you look statistically over the years, like 90% of the orphanages were started by Christian organizations.
Right.
And of those, the funding for them is 92% from Christians that fund those orphanages around the world.
Like donations.
Through donations.
Yeah.
And I think because the whole idea of giving back to God isn't something that we're supposed to be advertising, if that.
So well, it says, don't let the left hand know what the right hand does. Yeah.
Right. And so there are a lot of these things that schools, hospitals, historically, orphanages were started by Christians. They saw a need in society because life was not being valued, that they stepped in and provided care. They were the ones that clear back in first century Rome, when the plague hit, the Christians were the ones that ran in to help people versus the rest of society. It's like, I don't want to get sick. I'm not going to do that. And you can read historical accounts of the Christians were the ones that stayed and tried to help their neighbors. They were the ones that then, created hospitals and schools and orphanages and these things that feed into and support how can we be pro-life in the world.
And Scripture calls us as believers. I think, right, Proverbs 31:8 says, speak up for those who can't speak for themselves. And I think, this gets maybe pigeonholed and used for specific things, but man, it really encompasses a broad spectrum of people who maybe can't speak up for themselves.
And Psalm 82:3 says, defend the lowly and the fatherless, render justice to the afflicted and the needy. Sometimes we're willing to help people that can then help us back. And these situations that really probably challenge us to look at our pro-life worldview of, okay, maybe we're willing to go stand on a corner and hold a sign against abortion because it doesn't require too much of us.
Wow.
But what does it really look like to invest in the life of a widow? What does it really look like to invest in the life of a family that might have a disabled child that might just need support and to be seen in the spot where God has allowed them to be? That requires a lot more of us. And it might require us to get our hands dirty and
It will. It's not a might. It will. We have work to do. And if I'm just being totally honest, I look back at my past and I recognize there are areas where I was confronted with, people with disabilities or elderly people who I deemed as inconvenient, right? And it's like, man, I didn't value their lives the way that God does, and it's going to require work. I just, when we use words like it might or maybe, it becomes an excuse to not do it, but it will require us. I mean, Jesus said, pick up your cross, die to yourself.
And that's why did he make it so hard?
I know, right? Come on. But there are some things that I think you've seen. We had a conversation about some things that we have seen the church step up and do to get their hands dirty. You share a story.
In my home church, when I was growing up, when I was young, I can remember there was a young single mother who was embraced by the church, who came consistently with her child and was involved. And I got to see that it was not the way that they would have wanted, wasn't God's design for that, the start of a family, but that didn't mean that life wasn't valued and that God's love and grace wasn't present, and that's what the church should be doing.
Both of those lives,
yes.
Right? Yeah. And I have a similar story. My mom was a single mom raising 2 boys, and she would try to get us ready in time to go to church. But I think we were like 5 and 2. And I'm sure it's hard enough when you have a husband trying to corral 2 children and get them ready for church. But here's my mom just trying to do the best that she can. And she's pulling up late, and we're noisy and disruptive. The church service has already started, and this happened a few times. And the pastor pulled my mom aside after church one day and said, "Hey, we think you can do a better job of, getting the kids here on time." And that was like, oh, that gutted my mom. She was devastated. So she shares a story. I don't remember this, but she told me over the next couple weeks, if she didn't get into the parking lot before service started, she would just sit in the car, cry, and then take us home because she didn't want to deal with. But then, by the grace of God, someone, I think she says the pastor heard one of those like Christian talk radio shows back in the 90s. I guess this would have been the 80s. And it was talking about how difficult it is for single mothers. And he came to our house and apologized and said, show up whenever you can. We're just, he really kind of changed his tone in an effort to like grow. And that's all of us, right? Like we all have to walk through this process of God molding us and purifying us, sanctifying us, removing out the bits of us that aren't quite right. All the ways that we devalue life to reorient us. And that's the process he has us on. But I love to see those examples when like the church is growing and like allowing God to do that.
Well, and I think that the church has grown so much in those aspects of valuing those relationships, the relationship with your mom, the relationship with you and your brother, of like, at that point, to you guys who were so little, like they're representing Christ to you and realizing that's way more important than the flow of our service.
Right.
And the perfect. Because if you've ever been in church leadership and you've planned out services and programs, you want them to run smoothly. You want them to go well. You don't want disruptions because for some people that's distracting and you don't want people to be distracted. You want people to be focused. But then at some point you have to realize that God has to step in and change your heart and go, those people that you want to come in the door, whatever is going on in their lives, whatever they need is so much more important than whatever I had planned, whatever we had planned, and just being able to see
the value,
the situations that people need us to step into and show them love, show them that they are valued no matter where they're at.
And, some ministries that I didn't know about, I don't know how long they've been around, but I'm pretty sure they've been around for a while. We have a ministry locally for us called Home Sweet Home Ministries. It's a homeless shelter where they bring people in, they give them the skills they need to get a job, they teach them, they give them like classes and they give them food and they teach them how to take care of themselves and they take care of each other. I think they also have programs for people who, recently have been released from prison and to help them get back on their feet. Again, Rafa House Help, which is a program that helps. So there are some groups and organizations who actually go in and rescue people from human trafficking situations that they have been like stuck in. And then Rafa House. So I highly encourage you, if you're interested, looking for ways to support ministries that are doing these types of things. Rafa.org. It's an organization that teaches girls and women who have been rescued from human trafficking how to make like purses and girly things. So I don't know what they all are, but they're they're things that you can buy, and it supports their business model, and they're equipping them with the tools and the resource. And it's a Christian-based organization that they're teaching them their value in God's eyes while giving them skills.
And most every area, the other thing to look into is there are crisis pregnancy centers, and they are not only there to help a mother with an unexpected pregnancy, but also to provide support and resources once that child is born. Their goal is to keep those families intact, to give the mother the resources that they need to be successful in motherhood and to show her that her life is as valued as their child, and that child is valued too. And so there's all these opportunities where we can step in, but it requires us to do something, to step into maybe an area or something that we hadn't been involved in before, to do something, to see people in our community. Maybe there's a widow, someone that we can help.
Yeah. And so you mentioned the crisis pregnancy centers. There's also crisis nursery centers. Like we also have a local one. I did a little mini documentary for one. And there was a mother who came in and shared her story about how she needed a job, had a job interview, but didn't have anyone to watch the kid, right? And this, providing value for mom and child. And so nurseries, the crisis nursery centers. And there are tons of ways that we're seeing, and you're right. It's not that the churches haven't been doing this, but there is more and more opportunities for believers to get their hands dirty and not try and, start from the ground up, try and make something from scratch. But there are programs out there that we can just put our hands on and get plugged into. And, want to encourage you guys that, man, being a child of God he's got work for us to do.
And as we look for those opportunities, I think it's even more critical because life is being devalued in our society, and it's becoming more and more prevalent. And I loved this quote. Breakpoint is a ministry that tries to look at things that are going on in the world and how should we approach it from a biblical perspective. And this was their quote related to this idea of what does it really look like to be pro-life. And it says, in a biblical vision, human dignity is not the sole property of the strong, the healthy, the wealthy, or the powerful, but belongs in equal measure to the weak, the sick, the disabled, and the unborn. Throughout history, this biblical vision has been violated even by those claiming it. But in the name of Christ the Creator and Redeemer, we must care for the poor, speak for the voiceless, lift up the exploited, and love the unlovely, not because they're useful, but because they have been eternally and uniquely marked with glory by God himself.
I love that, uniquely marked with glory by God himself. Yeah. And I want to go back. We've already read it once, but Proverbs 31, I think this is where we want to land. We always want to come back to the word of God. What does the Bible say? And Proverbs 31 verses 8 and 9 says, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the poor and needy. Like, that is our call to action. And not just for you, but for us, right? Like, that's on us too. And we are striving to learn how to value life in ways that maybe we hadn't before. Want to encourage you. Let us know what are the ways that maybe the Lord has been working and shifting in your life and how he's changed your perspective. What are some things you've walked through before? And how are ways maybe that you've helped others understand their value through the lens of God? You can send us a message at tagcastofficial@gmail.com or leave us a message on YouTube. Subscribe, ring the bell so you know when new content drops, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.
See ya.
Love you guys.